That morning, inside the old cafeteria of Ridgeview Elementary, the workers thought they were simply renovating an abandoned building. Sunlight filtered through the fogged glass panes, washing the warped floorboards in a pale yellow sheen. Everything was so silent they could hear dust shifting when part of the ceiling gave way. None of them knew that within minutes, that silence would be torn apart forever. When one of the men wedged a crowbar into a plank in the center of the room, the sound that rang out wasn't like any hollow rot they had ever heard. It was heavy sharp, like metal striking a secret that had been buried. The board snapped loose, revealing another layer beneath the old tiles, coated in glue stained with the color of time. A worker bent down, shining his flashlight into the gapingly to find a dark, empty cavity below. A space that appeared on no blueprint of the school. They widened the opening. Cold air rushed up from beneath the floor, crawling across their skin. A small piece of fabric emerged. Its pattern for children faded to a ghost of color. When one of the men brushed a fingertip across it, the cloth crumbled into powder. And beneath it lay tiny off-white fragments of bone, scattered across the dry earth like a whisper from the past no one was ready to hear. The cafeteria suddenly felt too large, too quiet. The youngest worker stepped back, his hands shaking so badly he dropped his flashlight. No one spoke in that moment. Men who were used to the scream of saw blades now stood frozen, statues carved in dread. Because they knew. They had stumbled onto the history of a town, a history everyone believed had gone cold long ago. Minutes later, yellow tape stretched across the doorway. Patrol cars lined up outside. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, staring toward the school with the familiar eyes of people who had once lost their sense of safety. Because this place had been the center of a tragedy the entire Tellico Plains region would never forget. The tragedy of a 3-year-old girl who vanished on the calmest morning of 1993. A tragedy with no trail, no answers, and nothing left behind except a small red bow fluttering in the wind. As news spread, many simply stood there, hands covering their mouths as if to hold back the memories they had buried deep. Because everyone knew the name tied to that disappearance, a name that once brought the whole town to its knees in prayer beneath storm-soaked trees. Tila Marie Thompson. A gentle child, always smiling, clutching her little blue pillow whenever she came to school. A child who stepped into that final morning like any other, unaware that just a few steps past the playground fence, her world would go dark. 25 years later, beneath the floor where her mother had once worked every day, they found what remained of her. Small, silent, as if time itself had stopped, waiting for someone to uncover what never should have been hidden. And from that moment, a single question rose like a storm in every heart across Monroe County. If Tila never left the school, then who put her beneath that floor? And why did no one hear her call for 25 years? Early autumn in Tellico Plains had a kind of beauty that made people believe nothing tragic could ever take root there. The small town nestled against the Smokies, its red dirt roads curving gently beneath rows of trees. Mornings often began with the smell of roasting coffee drifting from someone's porch and the faraway bark of a dog, like a familiar southern greeting. Anyone who grew up here believed peace was as natural as breathing. The morning Tila disappeared was no different. A thin mist hung over the sky, and the first light of day wasn't strong enough to chase away the chill still clinging to the grass. Sandra Thompson held her daughter's hand as they walked down the gravel path toward the school. Tila hopped in tiny steps, her denim shoes stamping small round prints on the damp ground. She tried to keep her red bow perched on her hair, always slipping, always making her laugh and sigh like a much older person. Sandra worked in the school cafeteria simply to be near her daughter at every moment. She said hearing Tila's laughter drift from the playground each morning made her heart feel lighter. They had a small ritual known only to the two of them. Before reaching the school gate, Tila would lift her mother's hand, counting each finger and declaring whether she would be 3 fingers good or 4 fingers good that day. And Sandra would laugh, pressing her thumb into the little palm, saying her daughter only needed to be happy. People said nothing felt unusual that morning. Every sound was familiar: the wind brushing the chain-link fence around the field, the bus doors slamming shut, teachers calling students by the soft nicknames only found in small towns. Mothers chatted in the parking lot about dinner plans or the upcoming church meeting. No one noticed how fragile peace truly was, how easily it could shatter in just a few minutes. Around 10:15, Tila's kindergarten class went out for recess. The sun had risen higher, casting a warm glow on the swing sets still wet with morning dew. Her teacher said Tila was, as always, the the child who watched the world more than she played in it. She studied falling leaves as if they were the most fascinating things on earth. She chased a small red ball that rolled toward the fence. A tiny, ordinary momentone of countless moments in a child's life. In the cafeteria, Sandra was arranging the first trays of food. She had no idea that outside, in the back playground, her world was shifting. She remembered that the children's laughter seemed especially clear, that dazed patter of footsteps, the shouts, the wind sweeping across the open yard. All of it blending into the familiar morning symphony. Nothing hinted that it would be the last time she heard her daughter's voice in the living world. Years later, when asked to recall that morning, Sandra said she remembered two things: the smell of bread baking, and a faint, fleeting feeling of mother's intuition, like the sensation of unfamiliar footsteps inside a familiar home. But she brushed it away. No one wants to believe a bad omen on such a beautiful morning. Out on the playground, the children kept running under the brightening sun. The teacher checked her watch, calling them to line up for class. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted each face, hair tousled, cheeks flushed, breath still sweet with sunlight. But when she said Tila's name, the line faltered. No one stepped forward. No small hand swung beside the others. No cheerful voice answered. She called again and again. The third time, her voice trembled. On the steps leading back into the classroom, the teacher felt her heart tighten in a way every educator understands but never wants to admit. A missing child might be playing a silly game of hide and seek, or it might be something else entirely. Something that haunts adults for the rest of their lives. In the cafeteria, Sandra was still busy with the trays. She didn't hear the first frantic call from the playground. She didn't hear the hurried footsteps. She didn't hear the wave of fear beginning to sweep through the teachers like a sudden cold wind tearing across the schoolyard. That morning, Teleco Plains was still as beautiful as a painting. But that beauty within minutest would be ripped apart. And no one in that little town knew that the peace they cherished was about to vanish forever. The kindergarten teacher called Tila's name a third time. Still no answer. In the line of children, a few looked up, their innocent eyes expecting her to pop out from behind a tree at any moment. But the delicate morning haze suddenly felt thicker, heavier, as if it were hiding something the adults weren't ready to believe. The teacher hurried to the swings. No one. To the slide, empty. She bent down to peer under the small picnic table. Only a fallen leaf, not yet dry. A sharp chill ran down her spine, a premonition no one ever wants. She called another teacher over. Then another. Voices calling Tila's name began to echo across the playground, soft at first, then more urgent, rising higher, nearly breaking in the air. In the cafeteria, Sandra had just set a tray on the counter when the door burst open. A teacher rushed in, face drained of color. The words came out so fast Sandra didn't understand them at first. She only caught two: not found. Her heart stopped. Not found who? Not found what? Not found her child. Sandra ran down the long hallway, her shoes striking the tile like hammer blows against her ribs. When she stepped into the playground, she saw the scene every mother fears. Teachers spread out across the yard, bending to look under every corner, running along the fence line, calling the little girl's name with voices edging toward panic. The red ball her daughter had played with that morning sat in the grass, so light the wind nudged it into a slow spin. Sandra called out to her daughter. The first time, she held herself together. The second time, her voice trembled. The third time, it cracked, splintering as if her throat could no longer bear the sound. She remembered the exact moment her knees hit the ground, the feel of her palms sinking into the damp grass, the air thickening around her, the world collapsing into one question: where is my child? A staff member rushed out to say they had called the police. A teacher announced she would search the rear lot. Another sprinted toward the planters. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wet earth, as though the playground itself knew something humans didn't. Voices shouting Tila filled the space, becoming the most painful sound of what had begun as a peaceful morning. 5 minutes later, Monroe County officers arrived. The chief immediately ordered a lockdown of the area. They walked in a straight line, searching every tree root, every fence corner, every foot of ground. Canine units were brought in. They handed the dogs Tila's small blanket, the one she cuddled when she was sleepy. The dog buried its nose into it, inhaled, then sprinted toward the fence. But after only a few steps, it stopped and let out a strange, strained cry, as if the familiar scent had been cut off abruptly right there. One teacher stared at the tiny footprints in the dirt that vanished near the fence line. No trail leading away, no direction. Just gone. It silenced everyone for a moment, a silence heavy enough to bruise. Sandra heard someone suggest the child might have wandered into the woods. She immediately ran toward the direction of the trees but was held back. An officer insisted they would take over. But Sandra didn't hear him. Her ears were ringing. Her mind splintered into flashes of her daughter's red bow, her bright morning eyes, her little feet running into her arms. She clutched the officer's sleeve and whispered through trembling breath, "She can't go far. She always comes back when I call." Years later, those who were there said they would never forget the sound of Sandra calling her daughter's name. It wasn't just a call. It was the sound of something breaking inside a human being, the plea of a mother who believed that no matter how small her child was, she would hear her voice and come running back. By noon, dozens of townspeople had abandoned their jobs, their meals, and rushed to the school to help. They waded through grass, knelt beside tree roots, called her name into every thicket. An elderly man later said he couldn't bear the thought of a 3-year-old sitting alone in the woods, crying silently. He ran until his legs burned because, he said, if it were my daughter, I would want the whole world to search. The early autumn sunlight began to tilt toward afternoon. Sweat and dirt clung to everyone's sleeves. A helicopter from Knoxville roared over the treetops. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. But among the dozens of voices calling out, among the eyes scanning every shadow, among the dogs barking into the deep woods, there was no answer, no tiny footsteps running back, no crying, no trace of where she had gone, only silence. A long, unbroken silence that felt like the first warning that a tragedy had begun, a tragedy that would consume the next 2 decades of Teleco planes. By late afternoon, the search had shifted from hope to desperation. As the sun dipped behind the Smokies, Monroe County deputies extended the search all the way to Highway 360. Patrol cars swept the roads with flashing red and blue lights, cutting across the damp pavement. The area around the school was sealed off. But under the fading gold sky, one truth settled heavily on everyone present: if Tila were still nearby, they would have found her by now. And that fear wrapped its hand around every throat, tightening slowly. The search teams returned to the playground after 6 o'clock. The small red ball still lay exactly where it had been. Sandra stood there, unable to look away from it. The teacher tried explaining that the wind might have blown it over, but Sandra shook her head. She knew every toy her daughter played with. She knew where it should have been. And she knew the instinct of a mother when something is terribly wrong. Around 7 p.m. an officer noticed a small detail near the fence line behind the school's maintenance area. A red hair bow damp from the mist caught between 2 tall blades of grass. The metal clip still held a few strands of fine pale hair. Sandra saw it and collapsed instantly. They had to help her into the office so she wouldn't hurt herself. She wouldn't let go of the bow, touching it repeatedly as though, somewhere out there, her daughter was reaching for her too. The cruelest part was where the bow had been found, near the maintenance shed, near the storage area, near the man who had worked there for years without anyone giving him a second thought. Carl Densmore, the quiet janitor who arrived before sunrise and left long after the lights went out. People in Teleco planes often saw him pushing his tool cart through the halls, head down, never talking much. No one disliked him. But few truly knew what went on in his mind. Police went to the maintenance shed that very night. Carl said he had been there all morning, repairing tools and checking pipes. He recited every step in detail as if rehearsed. He insisted he hadn't seen the little girl pass by. His voice was steady, his eyes unwavering. But a young officer later said he never forgot Carl's hands stew clean, too dry. Like the hands of someone who had washed them repeatedly throughout the day. When rumors reached the town, the atmosphere in Teleco planes began to change. Conversations in diners turned cautious. People held their gazes a second too long. Nobody said it outright, but everyone sensed the name being whispered. Carl, the man who lived alone at the end of the dirt road, the man who rarely spoke, the man who held keys to every door in the school, the man who had been near the place where the red bow appeared. Yet others defended him. They said he'd worked there a decade without a single issue. They said he was gentle, patient with the kids, willing to fix every broken chair without being asked. Half the town believed he was innocent. The other half couldn't shake the feeling that his quietness was exactly what made him suspicious. The divide began with small comments, then spread to porches, Sunday services, and the now empty school hallways. Meanwhile, TBI investigators questioned the placement of the bow. It was found in a direction Teeler rarely played. A place few children ever wandered. A patch of ground between the cafeteria and the maintenance shed. One officer noted that if she had chased the ball, she would have run the opposite way back toward the playground. There was no reason for her to turn toward the shed, unless someone called her, Or someone carried her. Carl was summoned again. He gave the same statements. Calm, steady, almost unnervingly controlled as though used to being doubted. But fear in the community had grown beyond containment. People changed their door locks. Children were no longer allowed outside alone. Mothers looked at each other with sleepless, red-rimmed eyes. Every night sound became suspicious: a passing car, a shadow near a window, a dog barking in the distance. A once gentle town had become a place where anyone might be a suspect. Strangers were feared, neighbors were questioned, and the school grounds were looked upon with a blend of familiarity and dread. Yet despite every suspicion surrounding Carl, police found nothing to charge him with. No evidence, no witnesses, no contradictory statement, only his silence, and sometimes silence is more terrifying than any noise. The red bow became the symbol of the tragedy, a tiny object carrying 1,000 unanswered questions, placed carefully inside an evidence bag, a few strands of hair still clinging to the metal clasp. And Tellico Plains understood at that moment that the town had split into two: those who clung to goodness, and those consumed by fear. They still lived on the same streets, in the same church pews, under the same beautiful autumns. But none of them truly believed peace would ever return. In the first weeks after Tila disappeared, Tellico Plains lived in a half-waking, half-dreaming state. Each morning, people rose with the fragile hope that Todi Finalither would be news. But the days stretched on, long and heavy, like winter arriving early. Posters with the little girl's face were taped to every storefront. Every time the wind lifted the edge of the paper, the soft flutter sounded like a painful reminder that she still hadn't come home. The Thompson family existed inside a silence no words could ever fully describe. Sandra kept her daughter's room exactly as it was. The tiny elephant pillow lay neatly on the bed. The toys on the shelves were dusted every week. She refused to let a single speck settle on anything that belonged to Tilibcause. Keeping everything unchanged felt like keeping the door open for her daughter to walk back in at any moment. Years later, Sandra admitted she always left the door slightly ajar each night. She couldn't bear the thought of her child returning and finding it closed. The school where everything began slowly became a scar on the town. The cafeteria where Sandra had worked became a place no teacher wanted to pass through after dark. Night staff claimed they heard footsteps like a small child running along the wooden floor. Others said they heard the faint thud of a bouncing ball. Some insisted they heard soft humming, the same lullaby the kindergarten class used to sing before nap time. It all started as small stories: a gentle knock on a classroom door when the hallway was empty, a white blur passing a window. Then the stories grew, spreading into whispers of fear. People said the school was haunted, that Tila's spirit hadn't left because she hadn't been found. There was no proof, of course, but the rumors seeped into the community like steady rain into soil, quiet, persistent, enough to make parents pull their children out of class. Enough to turn the school's bright halls into something people avoided meeting eyes with. By the third year after the disappearance, enrollment was half what it once was. Some teachers requested transfers. They said it wasn't ghosts, they feared it was the grief. It lived in the walls, in the floors, in the way the afternoon light fell across the desks and reminded them of a child who once stood there. Eventually, the district decided to shut the school down. The sign was removed, the playground padlocked, windows boarded. The entire building sank into silence. But it wasn't the gentle kind of silence that comes from rest. It was a heavy silence ethic, suffocating, as though every classroom held a fragment of an unfinished story from a morning no one wanted to remember. People in town gradually stopped walking past the school. They chose longer routes, even if it added minutes to their day. They said the sight of the abandoned building tightened something in their chest, forcing the image of Tila into their minds, a blonde-haired girl, running in the sun, then vanishing as if she had never existed at all. But some came to the fence to leave flowers. Not to search, not to beg for answers, just to apologize. To apologize for not finding her, for the years of fear that made neighbors doubt one another, for the long silence that made the Thompson family's grief feel impossibly heavy. By the fifth autumn, fallen leaves blanketed the schoolyard in gold and brown. Some children whispered that if you stood at the back fence at dusk and listened closely, you might hear a tiny laugh carried on the breeze. But the adults were done with ghost stories. They were exhausted by the fog of sorrow that never seemed to lift. The Thompson family left Tellico Plains a few years later. Sandra said she couldn't bear driving past the school and imagining her daughter somewhere in the darkness beneath it. They moved to Knoxville, carrying with them a box of Tila's keepsakes and the faded red bow. But even distance couldn't free them. Grief followed like a shadow appearing in the quiet of unfamiliar rooms, in the sound of children laughing in supermarket aisles, in the earthy smell of early morning that reminded them of the playground. For 2 decades, Tila's disappearance wasn't just a mystery, it was a presence, a weight suspended over the town, a wound so deep that, no matter how many layers of time settled on it, people felt it throb in moments they least expected. A reminder that some tragedies don't fidethi simply settle beneath the surface. And beneath the rotting wooden floorboards, inside the abandoned cafeteria, the truth was still there, silent, waiting to be found. Years passed, and Ridgeview Elementary stood frozen like a forgotten marker in time. Grass climbed to knee height, and the old windows gathered so much dust that no light could pass through anymore. Every gust of wind that slipped through the boarded hallways produced a low, aching moan, an unsettling sound that made anyone walking by shiver without knowing why. The school wasn't just abandoned. It had been left behind, as if the entire town had tried to drape a heavy curtain over a memory no one was brave enough to touch. But in 2018, the county announced a decision that shocked many. They wanted to redevelop the land, transforming the old building into a new community center, a space for art classes, town meetings, a safe place for children to play. For the first time in years, people spoke about Ridgeview not in whispers, but with a fragile spark of hope. Still, that hope was only a small candle in a room overrun with shadows. Many didn't want to return, didn't want to disturb the past. But others felt it was time to open the door again. To heal, they said. To reclaim a piece of the town's lost spirit. When workers entered the building that April, they said the air felt different. Not cold, not dark, just heavy. As if every wall held the breath of time itself. Even so, they pressed on, removing ceiling panels, replacing wiring, prying up warped wooden boards. With each layer lifted, a cloud of the past rose into the warm southern light. From a distance, townspeople watched. Some smiled for the first time in years, believing the place that held so much pain might finally bring joy instead. Others stood still, as though instinct warned them that some things shouldn't be touched. Some secrets, once opened, would change everything. And they were right. Only a few weeks into the renovation, a small crack sounded from the old cafeteria floor. A tiny snap, barely louder than a twig breaking, but enough to send a chill racing down a worker's spine. Because in that very moment, the truth hidden for 25 years began to surface. Not with a scream, not with any obvious sign, just a single sound rising from beneath the rotted wood. The candle of hope had barely begun to glow when the winds of the past blew harshly against it. And that was only the beginning, the first tremor of a revelation that would force all of Tellico Plains to confront the pain they had tried so hard to bury. That morning, Ridgeview's cafeteria held nothing but the sound of hammers striking old boards and dust drifting through slanted sunlight. An older worker, Somion, who had repaired more buildings than he could remember, froze when the tip of his crowbar hit something unnaturally solid beneath the floor. The sound that rose was sharp and heavy, not the hollow thud of rotten wood, but something hidden with intention. He crouched down and called 2 others over. They removed each plank carefully, peeling back the layers like the shell of a secret none of them wanted to name. When the final board snapped free, a sheet of old linoleum appeared beneath it, sealed tightly with glue long yellowed by time. One worker shined his flashlight into the small opening. Instead of striking dirt, the beam disappeared into a narrow pocket of darkness, like a forgotten room that shouldn't exist in the building's plans. No one spoke. One man exhaled softly. Another swallowed hard. Then they enlarged the opening. Wood splintered. Dust rose like the building itself was breathing out. Under the light, they saw a small piece of cloth curled in on itself. The colors had faded, but the childish pattern was still recognizable. When the worker touched it, it disintegrated like ash. And just beneath it, mixed with the fine soil, were tiny fragments of bone so delicate that the flashlight made them glimmer like frost. The youngest worker turned away. The older man placed a hand on his shoulder and said only one thing: "Don't touch anything else." The first call to Monroe County took 40 seconds. Within 10 minutes, the caution tape was up. Within 20, TBI vehicles rolled onto the property many had prayed they would never see turned into a crime scene again. Residents gathered along the road behind the taped barrier. Some covered their mouths. Some cried without knowing why. No one voiced it aloud, but all of them knew the name of the child they thought would never be found. Inside the cafeteria, technicians collected each fragment with gloved hands. A cracked plastic cup, a torn scrap of a child's blanket, bone pieces so small they had to be brushed carefully into trays. Everything was labeled, bagged, and carried out in absolute silence. 3 weeks later, the Nashville lab sent back the results. An officer brought the paper into the meeting room, scanned the faces around him, and read it aloud. The DNA matched. No doubt, no error. The remains beneath the cafeteria floor belonged to Tila Marie Thompson. The news tore through Tellico Plains faster than any wind that had ever swept across the Smokies. Elderly residents stopped mid-errand in the market. Children heard their parents whisper the name of a girl they had never met. Small shops hung red bows eganquiet memorials unspoken but understood. In a small apartment in Knoxville, Sandra Thompson answered her ringing phone. She would later say she remembered only one sentence: "We found your little girl." She sank into a chair, hand pressed to her chest as if to hold her heart together. The tears didn't fall immediately. They came only when she opened the keepsake box, lifted the old faded red bow, and placed it in her palm, touching it as though touching her daughter one last time. For days afterward, the town murmured a single question: if Tila had been beneath the cafeteria for 25 years, why had no one ever thought to look down? And who had put her there? There were no answers yet. But everyone understood one truth: the day the truth was uncovered was also the day the nightmare began to rise again. When the DNA report confirmed that the remains found in the crawl space belonged to Tila Thompson, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation immediately reopened a case that had gathered dust for 25 years. Old file boxes were pulled from storage. Faded photographs were spread across the conference table. A 1993 blueprint of the school was pinned to the wall, stretched taut under the pale yellow office lights. Everything began again, but this time, with the truth sitting right beneath the floor that everyone had once overlooked. Younger investigators, unburdened by the assumptions of the past, began reconstructing every minute of that morning. They created a large timeline stretching from 9:00 to 10:30 a.m., the critical window of the disappearance. Red pins marked each event, connected by strings pulled tight like the tension running through the room. 9:55 children go to recess. 10:10 Tila seen, chasing the red ball. 10:15 recess bell rings. 10:20 teacher notices a missing student. 20 minutes. But those 20 minutes had always been a locked room full of unanswered questions. TBI dug deeper into the school's structure. When they examined the original building plans, the most alarming detail wasn't what was drawn. It was what wasn't. There was no crawl space listed beneath the cafeteria, no access hatch, no maintenance road. It wasn't part of the design, which meant someone had created it. And only a small number of people at the school in 1993 would have known the building well enough to create such a hidden space. When the personnel list from that year was reviewed, one name rose immediately, unsurprising to anyone: Carl Densmore, the quiet janitor, present the entire morning, holder of the master keys that opened every room, every storage area, every door teachers never had access to. The old case file recorded Carl saying he had been in the maintenance shed during recess. But when investigators compared that statement with dozens of witness accounts from that day, they noticed something chilling. No one saw Carl during the exact window when Tila vanished. No witnesses, no camera footage, no verification, just his word, and his word no longer covered the growing cracks. Then came the red bow, found near the maintenance shed where Carl worked, far from where any child had reason to go. No 3-year-old would run there, but an adult carrying her could. One young investigator said Carl's silence in the old files was too perfect, smooth, controlled, without contradictions, without emotion, like every sentence had been prepared long before it was spoken. As the team reviewed decades-old maintenance logs, they found a single overlooked entry that made the room go still: a request to inspect the cafeteria floor, filed 2 weeks before the disappearance. The note was vague, no record of who completed it, no follow-up. But what froze them was the signature on the request: Carl Densmore. Everything began to align. The crawl space created shortly before the disappearance, keys granting access after hours, knowledge of the building necessary to reseal the floor without detection, and the presence of a man who had no confirmed alibi at the crucial time. The truth was no longer hiding beneath the wooden boards. It was rising from every overlooked detail of 1993. TBI made their decision. It was time to knock on Carl's door, not for a routine follow-up, but to confront the man who might be the only living key to a mystery that had paralyzed Tellico Plains with fear for 25 years. In that moment, every investigator understood they were no longer searching for a missing child. They were searching for answers buried beneath a silence that had lasted a quarter of a century. A silence with a name: Carl Densmore. When TBI had enough grounds to obtain a search warrant, they went to Carl Densmore's home on a gray afternoon. The small house sat at the end of a dirt road, its tin roof clicking softly as wind swept across it. Carl opened the door slowly. He looked far older than the man in the old case files, thin, hollow-eyed, with shoulders curved as if he had lived too long under a weight no one else could see. He didn't resist. He simply stepped aside to let them in. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and damp wood. Stacks of newspapers rose almost to the height of an adult's chest. On the table stood a yellow desk lamp, casting a dim glow light suited for looking backward, not forward. The investigators began their search. Each drawer revealed only odds and ends, nails, pencils, utility bills, a broken watch. But when one investigator pulled out a cardboard box from beneath the table, he froze. Written across the top in faded ink was a single phrase: Ridgeview. Inside, the silence felt so thick they could hear the scrape of gloves brushing against cardboard. They found remnants of a past Carl had kept, like mementosa staff badge, a rusted key, maintenance forms from 1993, and at the very bottom, pressed flat as if hiding, was a small photograph, a little girl, blonde hair, bright eyes, sitting on the old Ridgeview swing, smiling with the shy sweetness only children have. It was Tila, a photo her family had never released. The room seemed to shrink. No one spoke. An investigator lifted the photo to the light. Along the bottom edge was a faint smeareneven blurred. Later, the lab confirmed it was Carl's fingerprint. When they placed the photo on the interrogation table, Carl stared at it for a long time. His eyes held neither defiance nor confession. It was the look of a man who had been running for years and had finally reached the end of the road. When asked how he obtained the photo, Carl answered in a voice faint as wind through trees, "I found it after she went missing." But the sentence evaporated when the investigator slid the file toward him. This photo had never left the family. It had never been used for posters. There was no place left to hide. Carl lowered his head, fingers interlaced so tightly, the knuckles turned white. Then he spoke the first real admission in 25 years. "I didn't mean to hurt her." He said that morning, Tila had come into the cafeteria looking for water. He told her to wait. Then he heard a noise behind him. When he turned, she had fallen. He said he panicked, said no one would believe him, said it was all just an accident. The investigator slid the forensic report in front of him. The words were cold as steel. The skull injury was not from a fall. The rib fractures could not be explained by a single impact. These were repeated traumas, intentional or uncontrolled. Carl stared at the report a long time. His eyes glistened but no tears fell, as though his grief had dried years earlier. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally whispered almost to himself, "I was angry. I was tired. I couldn't stand the crying." The words hung in the room like a cold shadow. Not an excuse, not a plea, just the distorted truth of a moment he could never undo. When asked why he created the crawl space, Carl stared at the table. He said he had repaired the cafeteria floor weeks earlier. That after everyone left that night, he returned. That he placed the child beneath the floor, sealed it shut, spread glue and wax over the boards. No one in the room moved. They simply watched the man who had hidden horror beneath everyone's feet for 25 years, like watching a secret that had grown old with time. At the end of the interrogation, Carl said one last sentence that drained the air from the room. "You don't have to believe me. I don't believe myself anymore." The trial of Carl Densmore began on an autumn morning colder than usual. A thin veil of fog clung to the town, as if Tellico Plains itself were trying to hide what everyone was about to confront. Inside the courtroom, the wooden benches were filled to capacity. Former teachers, parents who had searched all night in the rain, residents who had no direct connection to the family but had lived under the shadow of the case for 25 years. Carl entered the courtroom, a man no one recognized anymore. Small, stooped, his hands shaking slightly, as if trying to hold on to whatever remained of his life. He pled guilty. No arguments, no defense. He simply sat and listened as his own confession was read aloud. His silence weighed heavier than any words could. When the judge sentenced him to 20 years in prison, no one cheered. No one applauded. Justice had arrived, but it had come too slowly, too late, like rain falling only after the fields had already burned. In the front row, Sandra Thompson held the faded red bow tightly in her hand. She listened without changing expression. Only when people began to rise did she place her hand gently over her heart, as if confirming that the pain was still there, but finally had somewhere to rest. Carl was transferred to the state's medical correctional facility due to his failing health. He spent his final years quietly in a small room with a window facing an empty patch of land. A guard later said Carl rarely spoke, and when he did, it was only to murmur apologies, none of which he ever clarified or directed at anyone in particular. 3 years later, on a winter morning, Carl died in his sleep. No family, no will. Only a small bag of personal belongings, an aged Ridgeview staff badge, and a folded slip of paper with the Thompson family's address never mailed. When the news reached town, there was no uproar, no anger, no forgiveness. Only a wave of silence that swept through the streets, as though the whole community bowed its head at a conclusion that offered no real relief. Justice had been written into the record, but the sorrow, the loss, and the shadow of the 3-year-old buried beneath the cafeteria floor remained. Quiet as the wind threading through the Smokies, and as painful as the morning that wind carried away the laughter of a child the town would never forget. When the new community center was completed, the builders kept the old cafeteria's location intact. But at the southeast corner, where the crawl space once lay, they left a single tile unrestored. No paint, no polish, no covering, just a small, bare square amid the shining new floor, a quiet reminder that sometimes the most painful things must be faced, not erased. On the wall beside it, a bronze plaque was mounted. The engraving read Tila Marie Thompson, found at last, loved forever. On the day it was installed, a light Tennessee rain began to fall. People said it was a good rain, a greeting, a farewell. The memorial ceremony was simple, no long speeches. Just the people who had carried an unspoken wound for years standing together. An elderly teacher, voice trembling, admitted she hadn't stepped into the cafeteria for decades. A construction worker stood at a distance, removed his cap, and pressed a hand to his chest. And Sandra, she stood before the plaque, holding the last red bow she had kept. She didn't cry. She only whispered a few words that the breeze carried away softly: "You can rest now." From then on, each spring, townsfolk would place a few wildflowers beneath the plaque. Not out of duty, not to memorialize a crime, but to remind each other that a community truly lives only when it can embrace even its deepest sorrows. Children ran through the bright halls of the new center, their laughter echoing where silence once pressed heavy. Adults sometimes paused, looked at the unpainted tile, and smelled a sad, gentle smell, as though they could finally take a full breath without pain. In the years that followed, Tila's story was no longer told through fear. It became a reminder of the courage of a small town that refused to give up, of the persistence of mothers who never stopped hoping, of how a community, even one deeply wounded, can find its way back to the light. Some said that on rare, perfectly still afternoons, if you stood before the plaque, you could hear a child's laughter drifting faintly from somewhere far away. Perhaps it was only the wind, perhaps it was memory echoes from a town that had lived too long with its grief. But for Tellico Plains, it was enough to heal. Because in the end, what they recovered wasn't only the remains of a child, it was the knowledge that no matter how long the darkness lasts, the light will eventually return. And when it does, the whole town will stand together beneath it. When Tila's story finally came to a close, many in the town said it felt as though they had set down a stone they'd carried on their chests for far too long. Not because the pain had vanished, but because at last they knew where to place it, right beneath that small bronze plaque, within a memory they chose to hold with tenderness instead of fear. This story reminds us that great tragedies often begin with very small lapses: a moment of distraction, a door left unlocked, an adult unable to control a surge of anger. It also reminds us that a community does not exist only to share happiness, but to hold one another's hands when everything falls apart. Oh, keep walking, even when no one is sure if there is light ahead. But perhaps the most human truth in this story comes from those who were hurt the most. From the mother who carried a red bow for half her life. From the teachers who never forgot that terrifying morning. From the workers who stumbled upon the truth and chose to face it rather than turn away. They remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the act of moving forward while fear walks beside you. And in the end, Tila's story leaves us with an open question, one not meant only for a small town in Tennessee, but for all of us. Are there griefs in our own communities, lying silent beneath some floor we've never thought to lift, waiting for someone brave enough to knock and listen for the truth? If this story touched you in any way, if you believe a child's memory should never fade into silence, leave a message. Share it. Because sometimes even the smallest gesture can help a story be remembered for one more day. And in stories like this, every single remembered day matters more than we ever realize.